I'm Julie Herman of Year Quilt, and welcome back to the Quilts for Baby and Beyond Sew Along. Today we're going to work on Rookie of the Year. I know I shouldn't pick favorites, but this quilt is one of my favorites. It's round and designed to be used in a stroller so that none of the edges drag along. It also works really well to tuck a child into a car seat, and it's super small, folds up nice and easy to go in a diaper bag. It's a very fast project and very fun to make. So let's get started. Rookie of the Year features a large star surrounded by a border. This is created by 6 strips that go around to make a large hexagon, which eventually is trimmed into a circle. The directions tell you to cut these strips width of fabric, the way you're used to cutting most strips. And this is fine if you're working with a print that is non-directional. But if you have a print that is directional, you might want to cut it a different way. For example, I'll be using this rainbow from Tulip Pink to border the quilt that I'm going to make today. I wanted the rainbows to look like this around my quilt and not be on their sides. As a result, I needed to cut these length of fabric because the way that the fabric is printed with the selvage, had I cut the strips this way, my rainbows would have been on their sides. The fabric requirements are the same whether you're cutting width of fabric or length of fabric for this pattern. That's not always the case, but it works out well with this pattern. So go ahead, if you have a directional print like mine, cut your fabric that you need for your setting triangles as well as your border strips, and then follow the rest of the directions as written. One last thing to consider when doing the cutting and layout for this quilt is to decide if you're going to follow the pattern as written for fabric placement or if you're going to do something a little different. The way that I wrote the pattern has 6 matching diamonds in the middle and then 6 smaller diamonds in 2 different colors. Here I have a white with cats and a gray with lions. And each of my triangle units is identical with my lions on the left and my cats on the right, and that puts the pair of them together to make the chevron at each of the corners. You can get creative, you can use different fabrics in the middle, or you can do what I'm about to do, which is I'm using one fabric for all of my outside triangles. So here is the one that I'm working on right now, and this is Tulip Pink's Daydreamer fabrics. And what I decided to do here is I used one fabric for the middle. This print has a nice large bird, so it works out well in a large diamond. And I've decided to use the ombre for my chevrons. So one piece of ombre gave me lighter, medium, and darker, and even some really dark pieces. Now I could choose to mix and match them so that I have more variety in each of the corners, but after playing around with them on my design board, I've decided I'm going to place pairs together that are similar colors. So as a result, I'm going to lay out my entire quilt and make sure that I keep the right pieces with the right triangle. If you're following the pattern as is, all of your triangle units will be identical, and this is not something you need to worry about. So once you have all of your cutting done and you have decided on your layout, it's time to begin to sew our triangle units. So I'm just going to slide these out of the way to show you what our triangle unit looks like. So this is what one triangle unit looks like, and we're going to make 6 of these. We're going to start by sewing triangles onto our smaller diamonds. Now for other projects, we have clipped the corners of these. That is something that you can do for this, but is not required or as necessary for this project. We're going to begin by placing our triangles on our diamonds, and we're going to line up a sharp point to a sharp point. So we're simply going to place this one here, and our notched corner is going to line up there, and our sharp points are going to line up there. And we're going to place this one here, and I should say not notch, our blunt point is going to be there, and our sharp point up here. We're going to go ahead and go over the machine. So a scant 1/4 inch, scant is just 1 thread over from a 1/4 inch, and it counts for the thread that's going to be lost in our seam allowance. We're going to sew those, and then we're going to place these on, and then we're going to come back to sew it onto our larger diamond. I put my pieces together over at the design wall, and you can choose to pin if you'd like here. When it's 2 pieces, I find it's not necessary. And again, My blunt edge is up against the side of my diamond, and my sharp points line up here. And I have 2800 Aurifil gray in my machine up here. It is my favorite neutral thread to sew with, and my stitch is a scant 1/4 inch. I'm simply going to sew down the length of this piece. And repeat with the next one. And we do have bias here, so you want to go nice and slow. Make sure that you're not stretching anything. Normally I do chain piece, but often I will make one block first just to make sure everything is working, and then I will chain piece all of my pieces after I know that that block is working. So now that I have these pieced, I can go ahead over and turn my iron on, or I have another option, which is I'm going to press these here at my sewing station with a seam roller. So I'm simply going to open that seam up, and then I have this Violet Craft seam roller. I find this super handy. There's a lot of things that it's useful for. And when you have small seams like this, it's nice to not have to turn the iron on just to press these. You simply roll along, and I have not had any issues with that stretching bias. If you are pressing over at the pressing station, make sure that you are not pushing your iron along your piece because you can stretch, and that you're going up and down. Pressing is up and down, where ironing is more back and forth. You would think that this would stretch it the way that it rolls across, but I have not had any issues with it doing so. Now that I have these pressed, I'm going to head back on over to my design wall. I'm back to my design wall, and I have placed my triangle diamond units back in place. The next step is I'm going to sew these triangles on. So I'm simply going to flip them right sides together. And again, my blunt corner is going to line up with the edge of my diamond, and my sharp point of my triangle is going to line up with my sharp point of my previous one that was sewn. I'll head back over to the machine and sew my scant 1/4 inch seam. I placed these together on my design wall, and now I'm back on my machine, and I'm going to sew the scant 1/4 inch seam here to finish my larger triangle units. I've pressed these just as I pressed the first 2 seams, and now I'm going to piece these to my large center diamond. And this is just the same as what we did to piece these triangles here, just larger. So we're going to start with this one, and then we'll add this one. So again, simply take this, fold it over. My sharp point will line up here. And if you'd like to cut a blunt corner on this diamond here at this bottom to help with alignment, that is something that could be helpful. I've gone ahead and done that here. So as you can see, when you line up your sharp point here and your blunt edge here, sew your scant 1/4 inch seam. You can sew either side first. So I'm going to head on over to the machine, sew this in place, press, and then I'll sew this one in place. I'm ready to sew my piece triangle unit onto my large diamond, but before I do that, I'm going to show you how I trim this sharp point off. It's optional, but it can help you with alignment. If you have the mini hexamore, you can simply line that up so that these edges match trim. If you have the super Sidekick, you are going to line up this edge on this edge, and then this solid line on this line. And I often do end up doing this at the machine if I haven't yet done it. It's personal preference, but simply just going to cut that little triangle off. And now I have a blunt corner. And what that will do, as I showed you over at my design wall, is that will allow me to have my blunt corner line up here and my sharp point line up here. Again, you can choose to pin this. It is a longer seam than what we've been doing. I'm not going to pin it. I'm comfortable just going ahead and over the machine, but either choice is correct, whatever works best for you. Make sure everything stays where it needs to be. And one thing that can be helpful here is a stiletto. I have a bunch of different ones. You want to make sure you don't flip your open seams that you pressed open so nicely so everything will lay flat. So simply hold that down as you're getting close to the presser foot. and sew the length of that seam. Now I've already gone ahead and done one for a different one of my triangles. So again, I'm going to press this open how I have been pressing. You might find it easier at this point because it's a longer seam to go ahead and turn your iron on. Generally, I would turn my iron on at this point. I think I'll turn it on when I have all 6 of my blocks done and get them pressed nicely before I sew them into the quilt top. So I'm simply going to use my seam roller, and I'm going to grab my other piece that I know is for this block, and I'm going to line that up right here. I've already trimmed this one to be a blunt corner, so I'm simply going to lay it on top here, and my sharp point will go on top of my sharp point, which should seem familiar from making the smaller piece triangle units. Line up the blunt one down here, and sew my scant 1/4 inch seam. I have completed my first large triangle for my quilt. I often refer to these as my pizza slices, and when you're working with a quilt like this, you can have 6 pizza slices. So I'm going to head back on over to my machine and work on chain piecing my triangles to my small diamonds and then piecing them to my large diamonds. And in my case, since I have this ombre and I want to make sure that I keep things where I have them lined up, as I go, I'm going to put things back on my design wall so that I make sure I don't mix anything up. I've completed all 6 of my triangles, and we're now following the directions on the top of page 31, and we're going to piece these triangles together into half of the quilt top. So I'm going to show you what the top half, bottom half is going to be the same. We're going to start by putting these 2 together, and I could head over to the machine and do the peel up method, which is what I did with Cuddles, but I'm going to show you how I would pin these. So I'm going to focus on these intersections because that's where I want to make sure that things line up. And then I'll worry about my corners. So I'm simply going to line this up and kind of peel it back to check. And then I'm going to place a pin on either side of the intersection. And I'm going to do the same thing with this, where this lines up. And one little pin here. And I'm not so worried about this here. It looks like it goes in a little bit. Things like that happen. I can kind of shift that at the machine, but I'm primarily worried about this and this. So if it's a little bit scant on this piece here, that will be okay. And then I'm going to take my corners, line them up, 1 pin, and line up these points that are my center points, and put in a pin, and head on over to the machine. I'm over at my sewing machine, and I'm going to sew together my first 2 pizza slices that I pinned over on my cutting board. And I'm not going to worry about backstitching here because I am going to be adding a border. Get my little leader ender out of the way. Make sure you pull out your pins as you go, especially if they are in your seam allowance. You don't want to sew over a pin. That's very bad for your machine. And as I mentioned earlier, I have a bunch of different stilettos. I tend to usually just grab whichever one's closest. This is my tulip pink one. They're very helpful to keep your seams down that we pressed open so nicely so that things continue to lay nice and flat. I'm simply going to trim off my scrap, so back onto my scrap. Having that there is a nice way to avoid getting that thread nest that can happen when there's nothing in between. I'm going to open this up, see how it looks. And I think that looks pretty good. Those lined up pretty well. Those lined up pretty well. So I'm going to go head on over to my iron and press this seam open. I'm going to start by finger pressing just to get it started. Like that. And then I'm going to use my heat resistant stiletto. This end is silicone, can't be burnt. This end can, so don't use that end. Make sure you use the soft gray end. And I'm going to use that instead of my finger to help hold the seam open as I walk my iron down. You don't want to push, that is ironing. We want to press. Pressing is up and down with a little bit of a wiggle. And wherever you would go to use your finger, go ahead and use your heat-resistant stiletto. Now that I have these two sewn and pressed, I'm going to go ahead and add the third one. Simply going to flip it on top, line these up and pin as I did with the first one, and head over to the sewing machine. Now that I have the second seam sewn, I'm going to go ahead and press this open just as I pressed this first seam. Again, I'm going to finger press, use my heat-resistant stiletto, and walk along the way with my iron, making sure that I'm pressing and not ironing. When you iron, you can stretch things, and since we are working with some bias here, we don't want to inadvertently stretch anything, especially after we've taken all this time to piece everything together so well and match everything up. I'm now going to repeat these same steps with the other 3 triangles to complete the second half of my quilt top. I have finished sewing both halves of the center of my quilt top. And the next step is to sew this long seam. Now, if you have used the same colored diamonds for all 6 on the inside the way that I did, matching up this point is not as important as it normally would be because it's the same fabric. You don't want it to be off by a lot, but it's not where your eye is going to go. It's more important to focus on this seam, here, and here. Now, if you've gotten scrappy with yours and you have a variety of diamonds in here, then you'll want to make sure that you match up this point accurately. I suggest doing a hang pin if that's the case, and you can see how to do that in the video from a few weeks ago when we did triangles. I'll link that below. So I'm simply going to take this piece, fold it onto this one, and I'm going to pin. Just as I pinned the single seams, I'm going to match up now and pin here, 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 and here first, and then I'll line up my middle and my corners. I'm not as worried about those. And then I will head over to the machine to sew the length of the seam the same way that I did the smaller seams. I sewed my middle seam, pressed it, and now I have completed the center of my quilt top. And if you look closely, I did not get exactly my points lined up, but it doesn't bother me since it's the same fabric, especially since it's so busy, you don't see it. But what I did do was get these points lined up well, and that's where your eye is going to go. Now, the next step is to begin to sew on the borders. And we're going to start with 2 opposite sides. And with border pieces, yours is probably shorter. I haven't cut mine down yet. And we're going to head on over to the machine. I'm not going to pin it. And I'm going to show you over at the machine how I think it's best to sew this border on. Normally when you sew something like a border on, you would put the smaller piece on top of the larger piece like this and sew your seam. But in this case, what that's going to do is it's going to make it that I can't see my points and what's going on down here. So instead of doing it this way, I'm going to sew with my quilt on top. So this is what that's going to look like. I'm going to line my piece up and flip it over. So now I have my border underneath and my quilt on top. And what this will enable me to do is see my seams as I go and make sure that I don't lose my 1/4 inch anywhere along the way. Now your piece is a little bit longer than necessary, but it's not infinitely longer. Mine's a little bit longer because I cut mine length of fabric and haven't trimmed it down yet. So you want to make sure that you start on the piece, not too far down, but about 1/2 inch is good so that you just have a little piece up here. And we have our same machine settings, which is the scant 1/4 inch seam. And what I'm going to focus on is sewing and making sure that I don't lose these points. So I'm going to grab my stiletto. Got my stiletto. And I'm going to slowly sew and make sure when I get close to here, I'm holding my open seam down and that I'm focused on my needle going to where my point is. That may mean a seam that is slightly more generous and not lined up with my 1/4 inch guard, or slightly scant. Whichever one it is, what's important to me is that I'm lining up the point with my border. I'm just going to continue this process of slowly sewing from point to point. Now your border is or probably is, the same fabric as this. So it's not as essential if you go too scant, everything will be fine and wash out, as they say. But if you go too generous, you're gonna lose that point that you've worked so hard to get, and it would be a bummer to lose that. So in this case, I can see that this is slightly scant, so I'm just gonna go slow. And as I get close to it, I'm gonna move it a little bit to the left to make sure that I sew right on that point. And when I say on, I mean at the point, not on the point. I should clarify, at the point, so that I don't lose my point when I open my piece up. And now I'm just gonna come back to my 1/4 inch. And I'm gonna take this piece off and sew my second border on the opposite side of my hexagon. Now that I have my first 2 border pieces sewn on, it's time to press those. I could press this open, but since there's a lot of bulk over here, no bulk here, and it's my border, I'm going to press out. And since I'm going to press out to the border, I'm going to do it from the front of the quilt instead of the back of the quilt. Again, I'm going to make sure that I'm pressing, not ironing. We did sew straight of grain to straight of grain here, but no need to take any chances. And we do have bias here. If we start to push, we could set things out of place. So I'm simply going to press that, and I'll repeat the steps with the opposite border, and then we're going to trim these. To trim these points to sew the next borders on, you can use any ruler, but I find it helpful to use your Super Sidekick. It'll give you some extra guides. This angle here is 120 degrees, and so is the angle that we're trying to create on the corner of our quilt. So what we're going to do is we're going to line up this edge of the ruler on this part of the border, and this edge of the ruler over here. And this is if you're right-handed. I'll show you in a moment if you're left-handed. And the dotted line should be at your 1/4 inch points, because that is 1/4 inch. Hold it in place, make sure it doesn't slip, and simply trim. Of course, because I'm demoing, that didn't go well. All right, so simply like that. Now if you are left-handed, this is what it's going to look like. Going to line up your ruler here and your ruler here and trim. Since I'm right-handed, I'm not actually going to cut. I'm going to rotate. So if you're right-handed, just continue to rotate your piece around so that you're always cutting on your right side. Never want to cut like this towards yourself. So again, I'm going to line that up along here and along here and trim. Add this to my scraps. A little thread there I'm just going to trim off. Now to add the next one, we're going to go counterclockwise around the quilt, and we're going to take our next border. And in my case, since I have my rainbows and I took such care to cut them length of fabric instead of width of fabric, I want to make sure that my rainbows are always pointed in. It wouldn't be wrong if you decided to have them point out, but whichever way you decide, keep consistent. So I'm going to go to the machine now and piece this border over here, same on the other side, just how I did the first ones with my piece on top and my border on the bottom. As I mentioned, I'm going counterclockwise, so I'm going to line my border up, but again, I want to sew from with this on the bottom and this on the top. So I'm just going to take this piece, fold it approximately in place where it goes, flip my whole project upside down, and start again about 1/2 inch in. And so the length of this seam, just as I did for my first 2 border pieces. After sewing the 3rd and 4th borders on, trim those the same way we trimmed the 1st and 2nd ones. Then go ahead and add the 5th and 6th borders in the same manner until you have a hexagon-shaped quilt top. I've now completed sewing all of the borders on. They have been pressed and trimmed, and my quilt top is the shape of a hexagon. Now I suggest that you keep it a hexagon for the purposes of quilting and wait to trim it into a circle until after it is quilted. This holds true whether you are quilting it at home yourself or sending it to a long arm quilter. I send most of my quilts off to Teresa Silva of Quilting is My Bliss to be quilted. I think I'm going to have her do a pantograph on this, maybe either Dizzy Izzy or Soho. I haven't made up my mind yet. Teresa custom quilted the original Rookie of the Year quilt. In the center diamond, she did some echoing of the diamond shape and then followed with serpentine lines to fill in the center of the diamonds. She used graphic designs to echo the diamond shapes. She filled in the background with swirls and figure eights. The second time I made this quilt was for Nathan. This quilt was also custom quilted by Teresa. She alternated two different designs in the inside diamonds. One has bubbles and the other is swirls. She used graphic echoing designs and serpentines in the outside diamonds and filled in the background with swirls. The third time I made this quilt was for William. This time I had her use a pantograph called Caramel. I backed the quilt in Minky, and the quilting really pops off of the back as a result. The fourth quilt I made with this pattern is for my niece Ellie. I just got it back from Teresa. She quilted it with a pantograph called Toss Up. I've trimmed off some of the excess batting and backing, and now I'm going to show you the finishing directions for how to make this a round quilt using this sample. This quilt is pieced as a hexagon and then designed to be trimmed into a circle. Alternatively, you could add binding at this point and finish it as a hexagon. Directions on how to trim it into a circle are included on page 31, and I'm going to show you now how that's done. The directions tell you to measure 19 inches out from the center point to various points to trim it into a circle. That being said, depending on your quilting and materials used, your quilt may have shrunk at this point. So I'm going to show you how best to measure the largest circle that you can get from your quilt. Take a ruler, place the beginning of it right at the center point where all of your pieces intersect, line it up to one of your points of your diamonds, and see where the measurement is. Right now I'm getting 18 inches and 5/8. I'm going to repeat that process at a few more points. Looks like I'm getting very close to that 18 and 5/8 again. Which means that my quilt shrunk evenly all around. Again, 18 and 5/8. So that's going to be the measurement that I use. So in order to make sure that I stay at that measurement, I'm going to take a piece of blue painter's tape, measure to 18 and 5/8, and place that tape. That way I don't have to worry about where I'm at, and I'm always going to be at that same place. So now what I'm going to do is I know that from my center to all of my flat sides is already measured. But I need to measure the curves to turn this into a circle. So follow the directions as shown on page 31. You line this up with one of the center lines, and I'm going to use my center line here, and mark. I don't need to mark that one because, as I mentioned, I know exactly where that is. So the next ones I'm going to mark are along the lines to my furthest points. So I'm going to take my mark on my center, make sure my line is along here, and in this case I'm using a chalk pen or a chalk marker, and this is because I have a dark background, so if I use something light you wouldn't be able to see it. So I'm going to go ahead and use this, and I'm going to rotate around and repeat this process. So I now have measured all 6 of those and here. So now I'm just going to go ahead and measure additional points so that I can create an arc. And I'm basically going to use this as a giant compass, keeping this line lined up on my center. And you can either use the outside edge, like this, or you can go ahead and use the center, whatever works best for you. You can see that I now have a gentle curve all the way around the quilt, and I'm going to go ahead and finish drawing that with my chalk marker. And at this point I could go ahead and cut that with scissors, but what I'm going to do is head on over to the machine and I'm going to stitch right inside so that I have all 3 of my layers nice and tight together, since I'm going to be cutting off a bunch of my quilting and I don't want things to unravel. I'm back at my machine and I have put my walking foot on my machine, and I've lowered my stitch length to 2. I usually have it at 2.5, but I've lowered it because this is not basting. This stitching is going to stay in here, and I want to make sure that it holds all 3 layers together before I go ahead and add my binding. I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch inside the chalk line that I drew. Just going to slowly turn my quilt as I go and sew around the entire circle of my quilt. I'm now going to use my scissors to cut on my chalk line. Also, I can use my stay stitching line as a guide to help me create a circle. I've gone ahead and finished trimming my quilt, and now it's time to bind it. Originally, I had planned on using this pink that I'm using for a few of the quilts that coordinate for my baby niece, but I'm changing my mind and I'm going to use this darker print. I know this quilt is going to be used in a stroller, and I want something that won't show dirt as much, and I think this pink would show a lot of dirt, so I'm going to go ahead and set that aside, and I made enough bias binding from this navy print to go ahead and bind this quilt. Binding a circular quilt is very similar to binding a square or rectangular quilt with a few differences. I'm going to go ahead and show you how. I've switched to my 1/4 inch foot. That's what I find best for putting my binding on, and I have changed to navy thread in the top and the bottom so that it will match my quilt. It happens to be navy, 3 different prints, one on the back, one on the front, and the binding, but they all are in the same family, so I've picked thread that matched. I'm going to go ahead and leave about a 6 to 8 inch tail and place it on my quilt. And I'm sewing my binding onto the front of my quilt so that it will wrap to the back. So the difference here is I'm not going straight, I'm going to curve. So I'm slightly just going to pull my binding, and this is where the bias will come in handy, and turn and sew around my quilt, very similar to how I did when I did the stay stitching before trimming the quilt. I'm just going to go nice and slowly around the entire quilt. I've completed sewing my binding onto the front of my quilt, and I've matched up my 2 ends, and I now have smooth binding all around. If you need a refresher on how to match them up, last week's video I showed how to do that. Additionally, there are directions on page 16 in the book. Now it is time to wrap the binding around to the back of the quilt to complete it. And here I have 2 choices. I can go ahead and I can hand stitch this onto the back, or I can machine stitch this. I have a feeling that since this is a stroller quilt, it's going to be washed often, so I am going to choose to machine stitch this. I'm going to take some wonder clips, clip the binding to the back. I'm going to do this all around the entire quilt. If you don't have a large collection of wonder clips like I do, you can go ahead and clip in sections. I find this is a very meditative process. I often do this while watching TV or with something in the background. I've gone ahead and finished clipping around the entire quilt, and now I'm going to go ahead and quickly sew on a scrap. Whenever I'm doing any finishing stitching that is going to be seen, I don't want to start on my quilt because sometimes you can get that nest of threads below, so I always want to start on a scrap. And I have my machine set to 2.5, and I still have my 1/4 inch foot on. I've just moved my needle back over. Some people might find it better to be doing this step with your walking foot. You know your machine best. My machine works well with my 1/4 inch foot going through all the layers through my binding, and I like having my guide that will help me stitch right on the inside of where I put my binding on, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm catching my binding on the back, and I'm going to sew around the entire quilt. I'm just going to do this nice and slow. removing the clips as I go, and I'm just going to give a check to make sure I'm catching the binding on the back, which I am. So I'm going to go ahead and sew around the entire quilt now. And it looks like I slid a little bit off, and I could tell that my binding wasn't getting sewn on, so I went ahead and trimmed my threads, and I'm just going to go back over that section. It's important when you're sewing binding on by machine to check as you're going to see if there's anywhere you miss. It's easier to catch now than it is to have to go back and do it later. If you do miss a spot, you can go back and finish it by machine later, or you can just hand stitch down whatever small section you may have missed. Just going to overlap a little bit, about an inch from where I already was. Do a little bit of a back stitch. Check. Yep, I caught it this time. So I'm just going to keep going and checking as I go. Thank you for tuning in here today. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it, share your comments with us, and subscribe to this channel. You can also turn on notifications for this channel to receive an alert when we post new videos. We're looking forward to seeing your Rookie of the Year quilts. Share them with us on social media using #JaybirdBaby. I'll be back here next week to guide you through making the Watch Me Grow quilt from the book. See you soon.